Hi, everyone. I'm Nikki LaBonte. I'm the Assistant Artistic Director at the Candlebets Horn Camp. I'm excited to be here for our newest installment of Horn Camp Connect, featuring Stasia Siena. She is on the Alexander Technique faculty at Roosevelt University, and this is her 6th year on faculty of the Candlebets Horn Camp. Stasia, thank you for being with us today. Thanks for taking the time to chat.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation, Nikki. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, so let's just get right into it. Let's start with big picture. What is maybe this is the most requested question you have. What is the Alexander Technique, and how is it relevant to musicians?
Yeah, so here comes the elevator speech. Yeah, so there's both kind of the general sense of the Alexander Technique. So for anybody, any person in a body who has a mind, the Alexander Technique is, it really can be applied to absolutely anything you do in your life to do it with more ease. It can, it really provides tools for reducing stress and tension, anxiety. It helps us improve our breathing. Posture is often synonymous, as you all know, with the Alexander Technique, and it really helps improve our overall coordination. And that's for anyone, right? But what we're interested in, especially today, is talking about why it's relevant to horn players. So, we can kind of get right into that, because for musicians, it's just a much more specific application of the same principles that anyone would use, but to do something that is a very refined activity.
Sure. When looking at horn players in general, what are some things that come up? Some maybe like common questions or common things that you see when a horn player comes to you and starts taking Alexander Technique.
Yeah, so I always kind of go through the various challenges that come with every specific instrument. So every instrument has particular challenges, and the horn is no different. Nikki, some of the things that we see, that I see as an Alexander Technique teacher with any horn player, are issues that come with the challenges of the instrument. So, typically when I'm teaching, I'll ask a student to kind of come up with these. But, just listing them out, and you all that are listening to this with us, there are things like, so the weight of the instrument, right? It's a very heavy instrument. And so the placement of the mouthpiece, the placement of the bell, you get all of this weight kind of forward and down, and that can really pull the head forward. It can collapse the body forward. So actual weight of the instrument is one. Another is just the asymmetry, because it is not played on the midline. Challenges that a lot of horn players face is that they develop some torsion, some twist in the torso. Oftentimes the left shoulder is a little raised, the right shoulder is a little back, and this can kind of set in as a pattern. Also, just, this is kind of obvious, but the fact that it's metal, that it's actually a brass instrument. So you're holding this hard substance constantly against this, softest part of the body. So injury to the chops, injury to the mouth, concerns about the embouchure. So I work with a lot of horn players that are trying to figure out how to really more efficiently and effectively relate to the instrument literally. So those are kind of the top three: weight, the asymmetry, and then also just the material that it's made out of.
And I know one aspect of the Alexander Technique is dealing with injury or pain. I know people will come and resolve those things. How do you go about, working with them? What are, some of your paths to solution for those kind of issues?
Yeah, interesting. I mean, you and I have talked about this at camp and elsewhere. A lot of people come to the technique because of pain. They'll have an acute situation and they're looking for a solution. But that's only one part of the spectrum. It tends to be people that are in pain are very motivated. People with tendonitis, people that have injuries, people that have inflammation. And so they're searching for a solution. And what's interesting is that for a lot of people, they're very accustomed to looking at the injury itself as the source of the problem. And one of the ways in which Alexander technique can be very beneficial is teaching folks that oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes the injury exists within a much broader context. So for example, jaw issues, they seem to be in the jaw, they seem to be related to the embouchure, but what if we consider the actual placement of the head and we realize that we're dumping all this weight into the mouthpiece, and then we begin to realize that, oh, actually the injury may be a result of a coordination pattern. So we can find an inroad into solving indirectly the injury. And that's one of the ways that we work with students. Another is I have students who come to me that are not in an acute phase. They're motivated by an interest in really just retaining what they have, staying well, even interested at times in a performance edge, like how do I become even more efficient, more proficient? How do I perform at a higher level? So we kind of see a whole spectrum. The pain, students who come in pain, students that are really trying to find a practice that will help them, really increase their longevity, stay well throughout the length of their career. And then, I have a lot of top performers that are looking for ways to really enhance and get an edge, as it were, to really stay at the top of their game.
Definitely. Full disclosure to our audience at home that I studied Alexander technique with Stasia for about 2 years. And originally, when I was introduced to the concept of Alexander technique, I sort of thought, I was thinking of that one camp of pain, and that it was for people who are in pain or for people who have injury or something like that. And that was what the technique was for. And, upon, meeting Stasia, chatting with her more, realized that it's not really just about that. There's a lot of benefit to be gained aside from, the benefits of relieving pain or relieving injury. And when we were studying together, I noticed a lot of improvements in my playing that I think if I had, mentioned those at the beginning, I would have been much less likely to put it in that just injury prevention camp. So if it's okay with you, I'd love to share a couple of those benefits that I noticed.
Yeah, I'd love that. I'd love to hear. Yeah.
And maybe we can, talk about how Alexander technique can help achieve those, some of the, basic principles. Obviously, results may vary, and, make sure to consult.
Right. No
whoever.
promises, right? Right. We do. We do what we can, but, in full disclosure, Nikki, you were one of the hardest cases. I mean, working you, it was a miracle that you improved. No,
it's not Horn Camp Connect without shots fired. Right?
Yeah, indeed.
So awesome. Okay, so one of the first things that I noticed was that I had, at the end of my study, I had better access to my breath. We talked a lot, or you mentioned the concept of ease just a couple minutes ago. And I think that was a thing that really helped me feel more consistent and confident in my ability to have a great relaxed access to all of my breath capacity. So could you talk a little bit about, how you went about dealing with this really difficult case and achieving that result?
Yeah, I'm just trying to motivate you to want to learn, to want to improve, to want to get better, right? So, I mean, in all seriousness, one of the things that, truth be told, you're actually one of my favorite students, Nikki. I mean, we'll tell the world now. Now it's out.
Watch out, everybody.
Watch out. One of the things that makes Nikki, what makes you a really wonderful student, and I think this is something to extract from the Alexander technique, is that you're a very curious person. And so, it's interesting that people kind of are in the sidelines sometimes kind of thinking like, well, how might this apply to me? How might this relate to me? How might this benefit me? And some people don't act, but what was great in your case is that, we had an opportunity and you acted on that curiosity, which really puts you in a mindset of, hey, I may not know how this is going to apply to me, but I'm open to learning. And so I think the thing that, how these things came about, I mean, you talked about consistency in your sound, you talked about access to better breath, you talked about more openness. When you and I have talked, this openness in your torso. And I think what's, what you're really noting in my language is that you learned through, a consistent series of lessons to really create a reliable framework, right? So, unlike with your horn that you can put in the case at night and you close it up and you put it in, barring disaster, that horn is in the same condition the next morning that it was in when you put it in the case. The body, the human body is just, infinitely malleable, changeable. It's being impacted by all of these variables, right? As you, the primary instrument, you, Nikki, the horn player, go through life. So, one of the primary things we learn is that we can actually gain some conscious control, some over this whole matter of how do we create a consistent and reliable framework. So, over time, when you keep thinking about, well, how do I improve the balance of my head to my neck? How do I really access my breath? How do I stop from freezing in my own body? All of these come from an increase in awareness that is part of this job that we have as Alexander teachers to kind of say, hey, you're performing at a really high level here, but how do we back that up? How do we stop? How do we really take a lens and look at how you're doing what you do? So you began to take these slices of your practice life that, I remember, right, talking about how there are these parts of the sphere. There's the performance part, and then there's the, we call it the tinkering part. And when we're over here learning and growing, we have to be able to be willing to like really turn on our awareness and start examining how we do things so that we can repeat the process over and over. And in doing that, consistency, right, becomes part of the game. The ability to not necessarily practice and do things when we're not in good conditions in ourselves, like just starting to be aware of that. Like, you had a really bad day, you go into the practice room, pick up your horn, like, what a shock, it doesn't go well, and you start to learn that there are ways and tools, that we teach you, that I taught you as a student. There are tools we have to bring our whole self into better coordination, and then we can go about the business of playing the horn, right? And
Absolutely.
if we had more time, we would talk about what some of those things are, but that kind of is the general outline of how we worked.
Yeah, absolutely. So I noticed that better access to breath coming with all of the principles that you talked about, the way that you can carry yourself and the way that you move and the way that you approach the horn. Another thing that I noticed in the same line is better access to my sound production. If I was moving previously, I had been moving in such a way occasionally where I would restrict my ability to produce my best sound. And, the Alexander technique, one of the things that I really liked about it, and I'm hoping that you could speak on, is, the ability to still be able to move and still be able to be expressive, with my physical movements without creating that restriction, without creating that tension that might creep into your sound or tone production.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there, and those are the kinds of, we talk about this peeling the layers of the onion, right? Like peeling back the various layers of habits. And so a lot of times restrictive patterns are habitual patterns that can be, oh, I have to hold the horn in a certain way, for example, or I have to have my head just so in a particular placement. The idea of some kind of end place or placement that we want to retain. And what we start to learn, because we've experimented with that, is that we can actually, I remember playing with you like on a spiral and going back and forth on this spiraling. And then, you look at me and you're like, wow, that's kind of crazy. My sound actually opened up. And we prove to ourselves that there isn't just one position, that it's actually this freedom in the coordination. If we get the spine lengthening, if we get the body widening, and within that, we learn to breathe efficiently, which often, and this speaks to your question, like, well, how do you do that? You know, it's not hocus pocus. A lot of breathing issues have to do with actually thinking that we have to take in more air. So another part of how we begin to improve is sometimes to understand, well, what's the instruction that we got from, you know, maybe a very well-intentioned teacher, and maybe we got that, you know, gem, that kernel of wisdom, and we're like, well, if that breath was good, I'll do more, and that'll be even better. So a lot of restriction, Nikki, can actually come from an overdoing, if that makes sense. Breathing almost too much, being a little rigid in the thought of posture, ideas about how we do things that are not exactly aligned with what is helpful and right. And as we begin to explore and say, oh, well, hey, I can breathe a little more efficiently, I can take a breath and go. And then, wow, my sound is even more resonant. I'm inclined to then do that again and again and again, right? So a lot of, and you probably remember this from our lessons, is us stopping and going, wow, you know, that was a surprise, right? A lot of things that you experience are actually surprising because we believe that we have to do them a different way.
Absolutely. I definitely remember that being something that we talked about, was sometimes the idea of like working hard doesn't always equal a better result. Like working harder, you know, can often complicate things, and bringing that effort in doesn't always give you the better result. The last thing that I remember noticing, which was, I think, sort of a byproduct, it's not something that we explicitly discussed in our lessons, but it's something that I observed on my own, was that my accuracy was better. And from my hypothesis on that is that, you know, all the things we talked about, my improved access to breath and sound production, those became more consistent elements in my playing. And that consistency allowed for a little more consistency of how I was producing that. You know, any performer in the horn, you develop muscle memory about, you know, where the notes are and how to play them. And if I give myself those consistent results, the ability to be consistent about my breath, about my sound, about how my body is in a way that feels open and easy, it improves my accuracy by result of that.
Yeah, I mean, 100%. And I do think that, you know, I mentioned it, but it's worth coming back to this idea of the primary instrument. For a horn player, the horn is secondary. You are the primary instrument, and you have to learn, it sounds a little cliche, but you have to learn how to play yourself. You are the instrument that you first learn how to wield. And so, sure, accuracy becomes it becomes something that you can rely on because the whole framework is functioning in a more coordinated way. And, you know, I just want to say for our listeners, because this is not, we really didn't think of this, you know, this conversation as a how-to. And so, you know, I want to really make sure that our listeners understand that we don't start out as Alexander practitioners and say, hey, Nikki, here's what I see is wrong with you. Let me try and fix these things, right? Like at the beginning of our lessons, I would say, hey, you've got an accuracy problem. And hey, I think that your breath could really use some work, right? We don't start with a prescription and say, well, let me tell you what's wrong with you, right? So part of what's interesting that you can't see in a conversation like this is that the results that Nikki is experienced and that are quite common to a course of lessons: improvement, consistency, better breathing, better posture, better technique. It is, in fact, that we improve our technique to do this thing that we're trying to do in a consistent way. That is skill building. The Alexander technique is a skill that is built over time. And, you know, we can tell our listeners that probably when you think back to the first lessons and I had you lying on the floor in constructive rest with a book under your head, your knees toward the ceiling. And a lot of students think like, what does this have to do with my breath? You know, I want to be a better horn player and I'm lying on the floor. And I think that's where we have to really make it clear to our listeners and anyone who might be interested in the technique is that this particular conversation isn't a how-to, it's just to try to give some ideas, right, about how we might benefit, but how that came to be was 2 years of consistent work in the chair and on a table and working with your instrument. And so, you know, this is not meant to be esoteric. We're talking about an end result, end gains that were beneficial, but we're not showing the process of how Nikki got there. And that's what's so cool is that the process is learning the Alexander technique, and that process is available to anyone at any level, beginner, intermediate, and very highly, you know, refined player. So, you know, I think that's really important part of our mission in Horn Connect is just kind of pointing folks in the direction of tools that can be helpful for them.
Absolutely. I mean, personally, I think it's a valuable resource. I think it's, you know, something that really benefited me. And, you know, the whole point of our conversation today is that, you know, that's a resource that's available. And, you know, it isn't just restricted to those who have injuries. It isn't just restricted to, you know, people who, you know, are experiencing pain. It can benefit of all levels. Actually, when we were prepping for this conversation, one of the things that we talked about was like gardening, the idea of gardening, you know, and if you go on, I don't know what this says about my preferences or whatever, and you know, but I'll sometimes get on my Instagram, I'll get landscaping videos where people mow lawns for free, and they're like run down, you know, they haven't been maintained at all, and they're these like multi-hour videos. It's satisfying to watch them, you know, clean up and shovel all this extra grass out. And sometimes the Alexander technique can be like that, and other times it can be like high-level gardening and growing specific species of plants, or, you know, propagating or things like that. It can be a lot of things on the scale of, you know, on the scale of gardening that can benefit a lot of different ability levels. That was, you know, sort of an analogy that we were chatting about a little bit.
Yeah, and I love that because, you know, it is absolutely this tending, you know, it's, again, it sounds a little cliche, but we're tending to the garden of ourselves with this work. And ultimately, at some point in our lives, either we're not tending to ourselves and we're kind of, you know, we're going in, we're doing the work, we're sitting in a practice room, we're playing the horn, but at some point, for many, many people, the lack of knowledge about the actual garden, right, of being the gardener of this whole incredible self that we are, yeah, it can lead us to a place where, you know, the consequences are not something that, you know, are healthy and beneficial. And for a lot of folks, you know, on the gardening metaphor, it's like as that garden gets older, right, the longer we go, complications arise in the body. So, you know, tending earlier, getting skilled earlier is really beneficial, you know, to the end result. And then you don't have to, I've never seen your videos, but it's hilarious because I can so clearly imagine it. I have had those Alexander students where you got to bring out the big equipment, the big guns, you know, you got a huge overgrown lot that you got to get back into shape. And then I have other folks, you know, where it's sprinkle in a bit of magic water on beautiful, watch the flower grow. That's a whole different way of teaching. So it's really, I love the analogy. It's really good.
Thanks. And again, don't look too hard into that whole algorithm
No.
thing. Anyway, Stasia, thank you so much for chatting. Thanks so much for being a part of Horn Camp Connect. This was a really great conversation. Obviously, I have a personal tie to it, but I'm hopeful that people listening will also find it just as beneficial as I did. And thank you all. Speaking of listeners, thank you all for listening. Thank you all for tuning in to Horn Camp Connect. We hope to see you online again, or in person at this year's Kennel-Bets Horn Camp in person. So thanks again for watching. Thank you, Stasia. And I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Bye.